B.1.2. Is capitalism hierarchical? Yes, under capitalism, workers do not exchange the products of their labor, they exchange the labor itself for money. They sell themselves for a given period of time, and in return for wages, promise to obey their paymasters. Those who pay and give the orders, owners and managers, are at the top of the hierarchy, those who obey at the bottom. This means that capitalism, by its very nature, is hierarchical. As Carol Pateman argues, open quote, capacities or labor power cannot be used without the worker using his will, his understanding, and experience to put them into effect. The use of labor power requires the presence of its owner, and it remains mere potential until he acts in the manner necessary to put it into use, or agrees or is compelled so to act. That is, the worker must labor. To contract for the use of labor power is a waste of resources unless it can be used in the way in which the new owner requires. The fiction labor power cannot be used. What is required is that the worker labors as demanded. The employment contract must, therefore, create a relationship of command and obedience between employer and worker. In short, the contract in which the power allegedly sells his labor power is a contract in which, since he cannot be separated from his capacities, he sells command over the use of his body and himself. To obtain the right to use another is to be a civil master. End quote. You need only compare this to Proudhon's comments quoted in section B.1 to see that anarchists have long recognized that capitalism is, by its very nature, hierarchical. The worker is subjected to the authority of the boss during working hours, sometimes outside work too. As Noam Chomsky summarizes, open quote, a corporation, factory, or business is the economic equivalent of fascism. Decisions and control are strictly top-down, end quote. The workers' choices are extremely limited. For most people, it amounts to renting themselves out to a series of different masters. For a lucky few, the option of being a master is available. And master is the right word, for, as David Ellerman reminds us, open quote, society seems to have covered up in the popular consciousness the fact that the traditional name for employer and employee is master and servant, end quote. This hierarchical control of wage labor has the effect of alienating workers from their own work and so from themselves. Workers no longer govern themselves during work hours and so are no longer free. And so, due to capitalism, there is, open quote, an oppression in the land, a form of slavery rooted in current property institutions which produces a social war, inevitable so long as present legal social conditions endure, end quote. Some defenders of capitalism are aware of the contradiction between the rhetoric of the system and its reality for those subject to it. Most utilize the argument that workers consent to this form of hierarchy. Ignoring the economic conditions which force people to sell their liberty on the labor market, see section B.4.3, the issue instantly arises of whether consent is enough in itself to justify the alienation or selling of a person's liberty. For example, there have been arguments for slavery and monarchy, i.e. dictatorship, rooted in consent. Do we really want to say that the only thing wrong with fascism or slavery is that people do not consent to it? Sadly, some right-wing libertarians come to that conclusion. See section B.4. Some try to redefine the reality of the command and obey of wage labor. Open quote, to speak of managing, directing, or assigning workers to various tasks is a deceptive way of noting that the employer continually is involved in a renegotiation of contracts on terms that must be acceptable to both parties, end quote, argue two right-wing economists. So, the employer-employee, or to use the old, more correct terminology, master-servant contract is thus a series of unspoken contracts. However, if an oral contract is not worth the paper it is written on, how valuable is an unspoken one? And what does this renegotiation of contracts amount to? The employee decides whether to obey the command or leave, and the boss decides whether the employee is obedient and productive enough to remain under his or her control. Hardly a relationship based on freedom between equal partners. As such, This capitalist defense of wage labor is a deceptive way of noting that the employee is paid to obey. The contract between them is simply that of obedience on one side and power on the other. That both sides may break the contract does not alter this fact. Thus, the capitalist workplace, is not democratic in spirit of the consent of the governed to the employment contract. In the employment contract, the workers alienate and transfer their legal rights to the employer to govern their activities within the scope of the employment to the employer. Ultimately, there is one right that cannot be ceded or abandoned, namely the right to personality. If a person gave up their personality, they would cease to be a person, yet this is what the employment contract imposes. To maintain and develop their personality is a basic right of humanity, and it cannot be transferred to another, permanently or temporarily. To argue otherwise would be to admit that under certain circumstances and for certain periods of time, a person is not a person, but rather a thing to be used by others. Yet this is precisely what capitalism does due to its hierarchical nature. This is not all. Capitalism, by treating labor as analogous to all other commodities, denies the key distinction between labor and other resources, that is to say, its inseparability from its bearer. Labor, unlike other property, is endowed with will and agency. Thus, when one speaks of selling labor, there is a necessary subjugation of will, hierarchy. As Karl Polanyi writes, labor is only another name for human activity which goes with life itself, which is, in turn, not produced for sale but for entirely different reasons, nor can that activity be detached from the rest of life itself, be stored or mobilized. To allow the market mechanism to be sole director of the fate of human beings and their natural environment would result in the demolition of society. For the alleged commodity labor power cannot be shoved about, used indiscriminately, or even left unused, without affecting also the human individual who happens to be the bearer of this peculiar commodity. In disposing of a man's labor power, the system would, incidentally, dispose of the physical, psychological, and moral entity man attached to that tag. In other words, labor is much more than the commodity to which capitalism tries to reduce it. Creative, self-managed work is a source of pride and joy, and part of what it means to be fully human. Wrenching control of work from the hands of the worker profoundly harms his or her mental and physical health. Indeed, Proudhon went so far as to argue that capitalist companies, plunder the bodies and souls of the wage workers and were an outrage upon human dignity and personality. This is because wage labor turns productive activity and the person who does it into a commodity. People, are not human beings so much as human resources. To the moral blind corporation, they are tools to generate as much profit as possible. And the tool can be treated just like a piece of metal. You use it if you want. You throw it away if you don't want it, says Noam Chomsky. If you can get human beings to become tools like that, it's more efficient by some measure of efficiency, a measure which is based on dehumanization. You have to dehumanize it. That's part of the system. Separating labor from other activities of life and subjecting it to the laws of the market means to annihilate its natural, organic form of existence, a form that evolved with the human race through tens of thousands of years of cooperative economic activity based on sharing and mutual aid, and replacing it with an atomistic and individualistic one based on contract and competition. Unsurprisingly, this relationship is a very recent development and, moreover, the product of substantial state action and coercion. See section F.8 for some discussion of this. Simply put, the early laborer abhorred the factory where he or she felt degraded and tortured. While the state ensured a steady pool of landless workers by enforcing private property rights, the early manufacturers also utilized the state to ensure low wages primarily for social reasons. Only an overworked and downtrodden laborer with no other options would agree to do whatever their master required of them. Legal compulsion and parish serfdom, as in England, noted Polanyi, The rigors of an absolutist labor police, as on the continent, indented labor, as in the early Americas, were the prerequisites of the willing worker. End quote. Ignoring its origins in state action, the social relationship of wage labor is then claimed by capitalists to be a source of freedom, whereas, in fact, it is a form of involuntary servitude. See sections B.4 and A.2.14 for more discussion. Therefore, a libertarian who did not support economic liberty, i.e., self-government and industry, libertarian socialism, would be no libertarian at all, and no believer in liberty. Capitalism is based upon hierarchy and the denial of liberty. To present it otherwise denies the nature of wage labor. However, supporters of capitalism try to, but as Karl Polanyi points out, the idea that wage labor is based upon some kind of natural liberty is false. Open quote. To represent this principle, wage labor, as one of non-interference with freedom, as economic liberals want to do, was merely the expression of an ingrained prejudice in favor of a definite kind of interference, namely such as would destroy non-contractual relations between individuals and prevent their spontaneous reformation. End quote. As noted above, capitalism itself was created by state violence, and the destruction of traditional ways of life and social interaction was part of that task. From the start, bosses spent considerable time and energy combating attempts of working people to join together to resist the hierarchy they were subjected to and reassert human values. Such forms of free association between equals, such as trade unions, were combated, just as attempts to regulate the worst excesses of the system by democratic governments. Indeed, capitalists prefer centralized, elite, and/or authoritarian regimes precisely because they are sure to be outside of popular control. See section B.2.5. They are the only way that contractual relations based on market power could be enforced on an unwilling population. Capitalism was born under such states, and, as well as backing fascist movements, they made high profits in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Today, many corporations, open quote, regularly do business with totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, again because it is profitable to do so. Indeed, there is a trend in U.S. corporations to invest in such countries, end quote. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as such regimes are best able to enforce the necessary conditions to commodify labor fully.